I'm sure enjoy this today. Dr. Stephen Steinlight is Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Immigration Studies in Washington, D.C. He's one of the country's leading authorities on immigration. He studies it from all angles. He's testified many times in Senate committees and House committees, and you've probably seen him on television or heard him on the radio a lot. He's got a great resume on here. He's undergraduate was Columbia College and Columbia University. His Master's in Philosophy and PhD were from the University of Sussex, England. He's also the author of several books, one of which, Children of Abraham, An Introduction to Islam and Islamism. He co-authored with a man, they both have photos from Islam, the Muslims, because of the book, which they did not like, so he's under a fatwa. Anyhow, Stephen, if you'll come up here, I'd like to give you a warm welcome to a good friend of mine, an excellent speaker.
Get my glasses on. Well, first of all, good afternoon, everybody. It is a privilege to address. We can't hear you. Can you hear me now? Yes. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you. It's a privilege to return to Tyler to address Grassroots America, We the People. Being the second largest Tea Party in Texas is cause for pride because this is one state that's brimming over with them. And I want to thank your Executive Director, Joanne Fleming, for inviting me, and my very good friend, Ashton Orvitz III, for handling the arrangements. Ashton is a true patriot, and you've got to love a man who has 3 sticks after his name. It's good to be back in East Texas. It is 13 months since I had the privilege of first coming here to address this group, and as recently as May 18, I was back to speak to the Gregg County Republican Club in Longview, and I thank you all for coming out today. As I wrote this talk, I was concerned that ongoing events would overtake me, necessitating the extremely unpleasant task, which I've had to do on many occasions, of a last-minute shift in emphasis or perspective. I mean, I've literally gotten off airplanes in cities where I'm going to speak, and that dreaded call comes to say, forget what you were going to say. Something's just happened on the Hill. But despite the breaking news, the Earth is not spun out of orbit, and for all the storm and drang and media-manufactured high drama of recent days, the big picture is pretty much the same. The deep state distraction known as Russiagate continues to dog the administration, even though former NSA Director James Clapper asserted there's no there after 5 months of investigation, and nothing changed that judgment after the much-hyped testimony of that timid Boy Scout, former FBI Director James Comey. All right, Congressman Brad Sherman of California has tabled a motion to impeach. Yawn. Die-hard Trump haters were counting on a rerun of the Thriller in Manila, and they were very disappointed, although they have tried, of course, to pretend otherwise. And that was demonstrated in their absolutely shameful attack on the Attorney General Jeff Sessions on Tuesday. That's one senator I've gotten to know over the years, and he's one of a handful I respect. Comey landed some very weak jabs, but scored no knockdowns, no knockouts. The high point of his testimony was his denunciation, lies, lies, lies. But all of this, of course, referred to criticism of the FBI and had absolutely nothing to do with the substance of the issues. Just a few days before, everybody keeps going down the same tracks. Our president once again treated us to a demonstration of his stubborn predilection for self-destruction. This is one thing that really does worry me about the president. I think there is a deep self-destructive impulse there. Through his addiction to the national Twitter, I take the point that it may be that some of us ought to be twittering more, but he is not one of them. the vast majority of Americans would like him to toss it into the Potomac. The most recent tantrum tweet expressed his anger that he'd submitted a revised, and by the way, much improved executive order on refugees, but now he wished to go back to the politically incorrect earlier ones that spoke of a ban rather than a timeout. I'd like a ban too, but you're not going to get one, and all you're going to do is get the back of the court up. And that might come back to haunt him with SCOTUS. I doubt it, but that would be extremely unfortunate. In spite of all the judicial nonsense that's been going on across this country, we are in very strong legal position here. We have every reason to believe that the administration will prevail in the High Court, considering Justice Gorsuch is on, considering Justice Ginsburg will almost certainly have to recuse herself. So why jump in and create a distraction that's insulting? My talk concerns the status of the president's immigration refugee addenda. Remember that? Remember he had one? Remember he got elected on it mostly? And from that survey we just heard reported on, it remains chief concern of voters here. Now you may be thinking, damn, can't we have at least a bit of a go at James Comey before I do that? And I like you too much to disappoint, but I'm going to do just a brief overview of the latest act in this farce that is sucking the oxygen out of everything else going on in Washington, and which will continue to do that under Mr. Mueller, thanks to Comey's leaks. We now know the goal, of course, of the Democratic Party, aided by its friends in the intelligence community, and that is to simply flood the media with false news over imaginary collusion with Russia, making it impossible for the administration to deliver on its campaign promises or advance its agenda and pass legislation. The whole point is to inflict enough public damage so that the midterm elections will go Democrat. Comey's testimony was a profile in cowardice, a snapshot of a man unsuited by character to lead an agency like the FBI. One exchange between Director Comey and Dianne Feinstein, senator from California, who's, by the way, pretty sane as Democrats go, and it speaks volumes. After Comey said that he felt, by the way, that verb was the most operative verb of his testimony, that the president was undermining his investigation, she asked him, why didn't you stop and say, Mr. President, this is wrong? That's a great question, Comey replied. Maybe if I were stronger, I would have. That's a pathetic answer. Comey came across as what the Brits call wet, a wimp under pressure. There was no way to reconcile his affect with the image we all have, growing up of, tough G-men with their Tommy guns hunting down killers and rapists and spies. The liberal media tried its damnedest to paint him as a courageous patriot who speaks truth to power, but it was simply impossible to match his performance and not conclude this is a moral weakling and a self-serving bureaucrat whose highest priority is protecting his own posterior, and he's certainly in the right culture to do that. Comey failed to knock down Trump or out. In fact, his testimony was a gift to the president. It provided the likeliest explanation for his being fired, and one that also lifts the dark cloud that's hung over Trump for months while this investigation is dragged on. And I don't know how long Mueller is going to waste our time with this, but it's not going to go anywhere. If there was a single bombshell in Comey's testimony, it was that he himself has been leaking documents. By the way, some of these are prosecutable grounds. We'll never know how many, and their aim has been to create the perception of a traitorous conspiracy. There was one leak, of course, that Comey didn't drop among all of them, and that's the fact that Trump was never under investigation for any role in Russiagate. And he made that statement to the president 3 times. In light of the damage these insinuations have inflicted on Trump's credibility and approval ratings, although we'll look at those polls just real briefly, as well as the president's repeated request that his innocence be made known, quite frankly, it's a wonder that Comey lasted as long as he did. I mean, the first time that he spoke to me if I were president and said, I'm not announcing that you are not under investigation, I would have fired him that moment. And I would have been, by the way, completely protected by the law and the Constitution in doing that. He operates at the pleasure of the president. He has no other protection. As to the other allegations that have continued to cause needless damage, Comey acknowledged that Trump pressed him to continue the investigation, and he also wanted to uncover the quote-unquote satellites, no matter who they are, including people who might be quite close to him. When it came to General Flynn, Comey played it close, safe, and sleazy, refusing to fully commit to characterizing Trump's request to let the charges against Comey go as a clear obstruction of justice. Nailing Trump on this was supposed to be the big moment of the day. It fizzled. A good D.C. insider, Comey refused to make a clear call, but that didn't prevent him from continuing the insinuation. And that is, of course, the classic way that cowards create an aura of further suspicion without actually tying themselves to it. But he did say, I just don't know, and it's Bob Mueller's job to find that out. My own guess, by the way, about the Flynn exchange is probably a culture clash and not much more. You've got Trump, who is used to no-nonsense, down-to-earth communication in his business circle, and he's pretty naive when it comes to Washington protocol, and quite frankly couldn't care much less about it. And he was speaking colloquially, and he was asking that if this much-decorated former combat soldier and general could be cut some slack. And the stiff, well-oiled, buttoned-up master of protocol, Mr. Comey, intimated that Trump gave him a directive. But he ultimately left this a gray area, but we will find out about this gray area. The only genuinely intriguing development in recent days is the president stating that he will go under oath and show that Comey has lied on at least 2 occasions. He asserted that Comey lied about the president asking him to give him, as it were, a loyalty pledge. The liberal media's gone nuts over this. And the Flynn investigation, and we're soon going to be watching, I think, a fascinating little drama, and that is whether Mr. Comey's carefully written documents after each meeting will square with Trump's tapes. Though it rests on no clear legal basis, the charge of obstruction most obsesses Democrats because they're fantasizing, of course, that this could potentially lead to impeachment. And as I said, we just had an article of impeachment introduced by one of the weirder Democrats from the state of California, and they hatch them out by the dozen there. But if you watch the hearings, what you noticed was that the Republicans hung together. There were no defections, unless you want to count what looked to me like a rather scary moment with Senator McCain, who didn't seem to be playing with a full deck. But there are clearly no major defections going on, and if they're not, all you have to do is count the number of Republicans in the House as opposed to Democrats, and count the number of Republicans in the Senate as opposed to Democrats. You know, there's no possibility of an impeachment here. I mean, end of story. But what about the merits? Whatever one may think of Trump's decision to fire Comey as a matter of policy, there is no legitimate basis for concluding the president engaged in a crime by exercising what is his statutory and constitutional authority to fire the director. As Comey himself wrote in a letter to the FBI, no one can doubt the authority of the president to fire the director for any reason or for no reason. For something to be a crime, it has to be both an actus reus and mens reus. That is to say, a criminal act accompanied by a criminal state of mind. Even assuming that President Trump was improperly motivated in firing Comey, motive alone can never constitute a crime. And we're going to see this when we look, by the way, at the way some of these moronic district courts have tried to declare the president's bans or temporary halts somehow non-constitutional. He's absolutely on firm ground. There has to be an unlawful act, minimum requirement, and exercising constitutional and statutory power does not constitute such an illegal act. Otherwise, the crime would place the defendant's thoughts on trial rather than his actions. We're not living in communist East Germany here. Finally, given Comey's unofficial role as a director of the 2016 election, I was surprised, by the way, that he didn't get a nomination, because this guy really did direct the elections of 2016. We're looking for the Russians? No, I think we've got another candidate here for this job. There's something decidedly weird about his leading an investigation into an election allegedly tainted by the interference of a foreign adversary and unethical behavior by one or both of the candidates. Why? Because, as I said, there is a compelling counter-interpretation for what went on, and there have been several, really quite brilliant pieces written on this. And, the one place you can find them is the Wall Street Journal, with great regularity. It's the only newspaper of record I have to read them all, but it's the only one that accords me that I find readable. That is to say, gives me pleasure when I read it. First, we know the whole wretched story did not have to play out as it did. Comey explained that he'd lost faith in then Attorney General Loretta Lynch, who wouldn't, to handle the affair. But it gets, we'll get past that into where Comey is really showing malfeasance. In short, in part because she directed him to describe the probe as a matter rather than an investigation. Now, that one of President Obama's political appointees outright told the director of the FBI to play the investigation down is a far more scandalous act than any accusation made against Mr. Trump. Comey said it gave him a queasy feeling. Remember, he kept talking, he's nauseated, he's queasy. I feel like thinking this guy could do a better job if he just had some Tums, do you know? But did he call on Ms. Lynch to recuse herself? No. Did he demand a special counsel? No. No, instead he complied with the request. And then he judged the only proper way to clean up the mess was to flout all normal FBI protocols. It was Mr. Comey who launched an investigation into Russian meddling last July and quickly expanded it to look for collusion with the Trump administration. Thus, before the election, we had one of the most important investigative bodies in this country politicize itself. It was acting like the KGB. It leaked the politically charged allegations to the press, and it cast an air of illegitimacy over the incoming president, which he has not been able to shake. This was a horrendous damage inflicted on the democratic decision-making of the American people. Comey could have spared the nation all of this by simply stating, as he finally did when he had to testify under oath, that Mr. Trump was not under investigation. One could argue he had a duty to do that, given the fact that he'd taken the unusual step of confirming the probe. But no, he judged it would be improper to speak out. The result, what's dominated the news all the time is Russia and the perception that the president is somehow in collusion with it. As I've said, it has sucked the air out of everything else. Moreover, it was Comey who had the discussions with Trump that he now describes as compromising. Under oath, he claims to have felt that Mr. Trump was directing him to, pushing him away from the Flynn investigation even as he simultaneously admitted that the president used words like, "I hope." That's not an order. He said it had been deeply uncomfortable that Mr. Trump wasn't following protocol. If Mr. Comey, let's get real simple here, if he truly believed the president were interfering, he had only one course. It was to report that to his superiors or resign, or both. Instead, he maintained under oath it wasn't his role to pronounce whether Mr. Trump had obstructed justice. Really? How strange. This may count as the only time Mr. Comey suddenly didn't have an opinion or didn't feel it was up to him to render judgment or take the law into his own hands. And why did he agree to have dinner with Mr. Trump in the first place? Why did he keep accepting the president's phone calls? If he felt there was something incorrect or untoward about this, he had no obligation to go to any of those meetings. Instead, what did he do? He kept secret memos, something he claims he had never done before. He wrote them down in, by the way, an unclassified manner so he could have that chip to play a little later in the game if he chose to do it. And all the time he continued to meet with Trump as though he were working to build up a dossier. I mean, this was pretty sleazy activity. When he was fired, he leaked highly selective bits of his privileged communications with the president through through a close friend, happened to be a Columbia University law professor, and then he remained silent and let speculation go nuts. And so for the past month, we've been mired in new scandals fueled by half leaks, thanks again to Mr. Comey. Yes, did the Russians interfere? Sure. They always interfere. Yes, Mr. Trump has a terrible habit of damaging himself by speaking recklessly, and he has tantrums and he rushes to the tweeter. Yes, the Hillary situation was tricky, and she was, as usual, thoroughly mendacious. Yet you have to ask, how different would the world look today if Mr. Comey had decided in 2015 to retire and improve his golf game? It's very curious that all the troubling roads from 2016 lead back to one man. It was Comey, arguably as much as the Russians, who was guilty of hijacking the election and absolutely poisoning the political atmosphere in America. And I mean, I'll touch on this point again. I've been interested in politics all of my life. I'm much older than I look. And I have never seen the country as poisonous politically. So poisonous that a follower of Sanders could attempt to murder Republican members of Congress, and we all have to pray, quite frankly, that Steve Scalise survives. He apparently is in extremely dangerous shape. This isn't the America I grew up to understand. Okay, finally back to immigration policy. I want to go through the chief components of Trump's agenda, identify some of the main obstacles that are blocking them into being translated into reality. And by the way, you know, I hate to say this, but I am talking to Tea Party people, and I think you guys tend to get it better than GOP people, that one of the problems is the staggering inactivity, quite frankly, the undermining that the GOP has done on Trump's immigration reform. In fact, the leadership of the Republicans in the House and Senate are on the other side on immigration. They have always sold the country out on immigration. Trump has walked back one of the most important pledges he made in his speech on August 16 in Phoenix. And there are some places that are critical to the evolution of this policy where he has been extremely reticent or evasive. And I want to conclude by citing what I think is the most dangerous of the potential of what looks like sort of a half proposal that he's put out there, he's dangled out there, but he's not really made up his mind about. I think it's something that could lead to tremendous violence, actually. A few broad observations about immigration policy, and you've heard me before. I ask your forgiveness because I'm probably just going to be repeating them. They cannot be repeated sufficiently. It's axiomatic that the astronomical level of contemporary immigration, and I do not care whether it is legal or illegal, is the paramount issue facing America. If we're going to get this right, we need to understand that immigration is one holistic social phenomenon and recognize the political game which those who support it, whether they are Democrats who believe that having massive immigration will make them the permanent ruling party, or whether it's the Republicans who want to pay off their crony friends in agribusiness and the service sector and a bunch of other areas. They played this game that there's legal immigration, good, illegal immigration, bad. That's the key reason for the crisis we're in. The fact of the matter is that low-skill immigration by impoverished folks will bankrupt and break the United States, and I don't care whether they came in legally or not. And by the way, one of the things that Trump has said is that in that really quite remarkable speech back in August was, the whole engine that drives this system is insane and needs to be replaced, and it needs to have meritocratic criteria, which would mean radically altering the sort of people who come here as immigrants. As I say, legal is nicer, but it doesn't make any difference when you get down to the fact that most immigrants don't pay taxes. They get tax credits. They are breaking the back of our entire social safety network. Social Security is on the threshold of bankruptcy, and so is Medicare. They will go down for certain if this continues. More than any other social policy, immigration has the greatest capacity to transform the country, and that is why the 20% of folks here in Texas who see it as the most important issue are 100% correct. It can unmake the America that we know and replace it with another, and that was Obama's long-range goal from his very first day in office. If it were up to him, he would have just walked out in front of the cameras and say, I nullify all immigration law. Now, he knew he couldn't do that, but he did something, he and his cronies, whether it was Janet Napolitano or Mr. Morton at ICE and all the others, did something that accomplished the same goal. If you make immigration impossible to enforce by destroying the enforcement effectiveness of ICE and Border Patrol and USCIS, you might as well not have any immigration law. And right now, effectively, we do not have immigration law. This country is in crisis because there is anarchy reigning in the entire area of immigration. There is no control anyplace. It's up to us because there is no one else to count on. Whether a knowable America endures or the day comes, and I think it may come more quickly than we like, when we feel like strangers in our own land, unfamiliar with its politics, its social arrangements, and, for want of a better word, common culture. If we start feeling like barely tolerated guests in another man's home. And I want to make a distinction, by the way, that's very, very clear, so that I am not tarred unjustly and that my ideas are taken as they're intended. When I say culture, I do not mean the nation's racial, ethnic, or national origin of its citizens. That kind of thinking is the essence of white nationalism, which is an anti-American creed. It is an ugly form of kind of soft Nazism. America is a propositional entity. The question is whether you buy into that if you buy into the philosophy of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, that's what makes you an American, not the color of your skin or where your father or grandfather was born. We have a different choice to make. Our choice is between maintaining the ideal of e pluribus unum, and that is a shared sense of national belonging that surmounts any other identity we have. And we all have lots of identities, right? We belong to different religions or different denominations, or our folks came from different parts of Europe, or we have different traditions about things. We support different baseball teams or basketball teams. I don't care. Or we're nuts or we're sane. I mean, there's all sorts of things that make us different. But when it comes to the idea of having a loyalty to this country, which is the ultimate and predominating identity, that's clear to me. And instead, in its place, what I'm seeing evolve is a sort of fractionating multiculturalism, which decides, by the way, it denies the very concept of the United States and replaces it instead with loyalty to smaller things and uglier things, like balkanizing identity politics. You know, your ethnic group, your racial group, you make a fetish, you make a god out of that. It's its own form of racism. And again, what we need to be concentrating on is what puts us together, and that's the number one thing. And when I talk about making our national identity paramount, I mean that we also describe ourselves without hyphens. You know, I'm not a Scottish American, an Irish American, a Jewish American, a Black American. No, we're just Americans. You have other questions for me, I'm happy to answer them. But American is sufficient for my sense of identity. Implicit in this idea is that we are not, no matter what all those nice left-wing academics tell us, we are not pawns of historical determinism. There is no inevitability about demographic trends. Migration is a natural phenomenon only if we choose to perceive it that way. That's what they want us to think. They want us to think that this global migration that's going on is simply like a force of nature, and we have nothing to do except kowtow in front of it. No. What we need to do is do things like enforce our borders, protect our sovereignty, and this is obviously something we see going on as a fundamental existential struggle in Europe, in Western Europe, and we're also seeing it, of course, right here. The level of population that we have in our republic should be a choice for the citizens of this country, exercised through their representatives in Congress. It is a political choice, and if we get it wrong, the consequences of that can be breathtaking. I mean, lest you think that legislation is somehow unimportant and watching the process is unimportant, you know, let me cite that example. I have cited, you know, on probably a couple hundred occasions, but it's so important that there's no way to overstate it. I'm thinking about the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which changed the whole game. You know, as you know, we had essentially mass immigration to this country by the great waves from Europe that began in the 1840s, largely with the Irish and Germans, and that great wave ended as a matter of policy in 1924. The country slammed its door in the face of that. That bill was not intended to increase immigration, and everyone involved in passing it and in conceptualizing it said as much. And I take them at their word. This was under Lyndon Johnson's, in the day of Lyndon Johnson. Its purpose actually was a public relations purpose. It had to do with making America's image look better in the world during the height of the civil rights movement, when there was a great deal of violent racism on display, like the little girls that got killed in the Birmingham church bombing and so on. Things didn't look too good. And again, they said to us, no, it's not going to change population. Well, what happened in 3 years? Our immigration quintupled. Didn't double, it didn't triple, it quintupled. Supporters said it wouldn't change America's ethnic composition. It wouldn't cause one group of immigrants to predominate. It wouldn't increase poverty. It wouldn't make the gap between the haves and have-nots greater. It wouldn't create competition for American workers. Wrong on every count. Wrong on every count. To grasp the force of this demographic explosion, let's go back a little bit in history. Let us go back 13,000 years. That's when most scientists who work in relevant disciplines believe the first human beings arrived in North America during the Pleistocene Ice Age, when there was a land bridge that connected Asia to North America, connected Siberia to what's now Alaska, and the first hunters crossed, searching for game. 13,000 years ago is a long time. By the way, there are a number of people in pertinent fields, geologists and others, who actually believe it's a good deal longer than that. But that's 13,000 years is a lot of years. Then consider the fact that fully 30%, 1/3 of everyone here today, came since and as a direct product of the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which we were assured would have no impact on demography. So watch out for those people who assure you of things. Since the last time I spoke to Grassroots America, some potentially transformative things have taken place. And as Ashton knows on a personal level, because I barrage him with this stuff. First and foremost is the birth of my first grandchild. My magnificent grandson, Julian, who will be your future emperor. Just want you to know that now. I have pictures, if you've got a few hours to share with me. Then Trump was elected. He replaced a post-American globalist with a decidedly deep, dark, radical left-wing view of just about everything you can name, with its antithesis, a populist nationalist in the tradition of Andrew Jackson. That victory was very sweet. Most people didn't think would happen. I am not a seer of visions. I am not I didn't go to the oracles in Delphi to consult with them, but I and one other colleague of mine at CIS, John Lahala, were absolutely certain from day one that Trump would win the election. And people say, well, how did you know? And my answer is really simple, because I actually go and visit the parts of America that everybody else flies over. And when you get to small town America, you get to rural America, and when you saw the enthusiasm out there, and then you live in New York City, where there wasn't a single button that anyone wore, or bumper sticker, or if they had lawns, there were no lawn signs. In suburbia, there were no lawn signs for Hillary. She was awful. Even they couldn't stand her. You knew that something big was happening. But our politics, I said, is the bitterest in my lifetime. Again, the murderous assault on Republican members of Congress playing baseball, getting ready for a charity baseball event. It's about as violent against something as innocent and well-intentioned. Most people are losing their faith in the institutions that are necessary for a republic to survive. Our warring parties don't seem capable of cooperating on anything. More than half the American people regard the election's outcome as illegitimate. There's anger in the public square, and there's anger in our own homes. In fact, they're statistically provable that the divorce rate spiked as a result of the election. The violence of left-wing thugs began at the inauguration. I wonder if some of you were there and were not even able to get on the lawn because of these thugs. And I believe that's a harbinger of much worse to come. Our colleges and universities have been forcibly seized by coddled fascists while spineless administrators just look on and as though they have no power to do anything. We are two nations right now. You got Trump in the White House, but Obama's not that far away. He never left Washington, and he's in a mansion in Colorado. One of our greatest divides, of course, is over immigration. And that is really based in a fundamental way on how we understand our civic identities. The paramount loyalty of the people here is clear, and that is you're an American, and I trust an unhyphenated American. Our opponents see themselves as citizens of the world. They don't have what they would see as a narrow loyalty to this place. Extreme examples of this position appear in great literature. It's usually caricatured. You could start with Aristophanes and go all the way, say, to Dickens. Bleak House, his character Mrs. Jellyby. And then there are much less amusing examples of citizens of the world who enabled such ruthless post-nationalist tyrannies as Stalin's Soviet Union. Now, I want you to breathe easy. I did not come here to critique Trump's first 100 days. Our Trump-hating media has done that with such diligence that there's nothing else to say about it. But by the way, their preoccupation with the first 100 days is simply a farce. This time frame is being treated like a talisman, like a fetish. And there are even historians who are lending themselves to this, and it's nonsensical. It's an infinitesimal portion of even one term, and with only one historical exception, there is no way to judge what's going to follow by those first 100 days. The one exception is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that's because he had political power unparalleled by any other leader on entering office. He won 57% of the popular vote, 90% of the Electoral College. He carried 42 of 48 states. The Democrats had a 59-36 advantage in the Senate and a 313 advantage in the House. And the answer was, of course, was the Great Depression. People wanted someone in there who was going to do stuff and lay it out for them, and Roosevelt did that. He had gigantic leverage and moral authority to pass legislation. The single aspect of the first 100 days of President Trump has been the attempt by the deep state in the connivance with Democrat leadership to essentially stage a coup against Donald Trump in the election with the no, there, Russia story. And by the way, there is an upside to those first 100 days that somehow magically is getting lost in all the newspapers of record. Again, except for the Wall Street Journal. Unemployment is now at a 17-year low. In fact, there are more skilled jobs right now than we have skilled workers to take. And Trump has talked about introducing an apprenticeship program. It's one of the smartest ideas I've seen in a long time. Yes, wages have flatlined, but that's been true since 2000. It's going to be a very tough deal to get those up. The stock market is up 14% to took over. Border crossings have plummeted to a 20-year low. We don't even have a border yet. They just know that that guy is there. That it's like that it's not Mad Dog Mathis, it's Mad Dog Trump is in Washington, and people are terrified. A tremendous number of anti-expansion regulations are getting eliminated, which will have long-range effect, terrific long-range effect, I think. And the mere warning of U.S. military action is a huge plus after 8 years of effectless Obama, who essentially surrendered to Iran and was completely AWOL on Syria. Now, the media obsesses over Trump's first 100 days, but he doesn't talk about what is at least an equally important story, and that is the disaster the Democrats suffered in the last election and the fact that they have not recovered from it. Their defeat in November was one of the bloodiest on record. And in fact, over Obama's 2 terms, more than any other 2-term president, his party lost massive numbers of elected officials. 62 seats in the House, 12 governorships, 959 people in state legislatures. The country's actually never been this red outside. The left has a huge problem with white voters, with white working class voters in particular. Clinton lost 1 million of them in the Rust Belt, and 3-1, she lost out on that group in rural America. And you'd think the Democrats would be thinking, how can we get this group back? I mean, this was one of their most important constituencies, particularly in the day when we used to have things like labor unions. But the left in the Democratic Party prefers to say good riddance to working class Americans, and is retrenching further to the left. And my prediction is that 2018 will be disaster for them. Right now it looks as though they're controlling the news. I think there's going to be an enormous backlash against the fact that they have essentially made it impossible for anything to be accomplished. Trump hit the ground running, and he fired off all those executive orders. And they got blocked by 2 forces, the deep state and the most left-wing constituencies in the judiciary. And I just want to talk a little bit about those cases, and then maybe just end on, there's a lot that I can't say that I have here, but I know time is precious. We've had a bunch of essentially constitutionally illiterate district judges halting the president's actions on grounds which have nothing to do with the Constitution. And they are so weird that they beggar the imagination. Robart's decision was, of course, upheld by the nutty Ninth. That is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. I mean, what would you expect? It is so far to the left that it's falling over into the ocean. They're crazy, and it is also, by the way, the most reversed Court of Appeals in the country. It also just recently upheld another one of the rulings. After the first judicial stay, a bunch of other extremely liberal and constitutionally illiterate judges jumped in from Hawaii and Maryland. And they passed restraining orders on the president's second, essentially his rewritten executive order, which was drafted in light of those decisions and really answered the concerns quite fully. It imposed a temporary travel ban from 7 countries identified as being particularly problematic as terrorist threats, and a 90-day period during which the intelligence agencies and the immigration control agencies could consider how they could come up with better vetting procedures. The administration appealed the Maryland decision, and that was unfortunately just upheld by the Fourth Circuit Court in Virginia. Now, Trump and his top aides are not completely free of guilt here. I mean, they rushed this out, and it was sloppy, and it left a great many people with green cards who were abroad at the time not knowing whether they could return. 60,000 valid visas were unlawfully revoked. It looked as if nobody was in charge. And that's the worst thing that a rookie president like Trump, who most people think doesn't know anything about policy, can make. In addition, the Justice Department people for Trump didn't execute very well. At the first hearing, Judge Robarts, who was this, all these liberal justices were essentially making appeals to, they weren't legal appeals, they were, don't you feel sorry for? And these guys were essentially welling up, literally welling up as they were speaking. And Robarts made the statement that, to his knowledge, no one from any of those 7 countries had committed a single terrorist attack in this country. The Justice Department's attorney didn't know enough about the issue to reply. The next day, 2 journalists, one in the Washington Post and one in the Wall Street Journal, came up with the number. No, they committed 62 terrorist incidents, but let's not get confused by the facts. This mess caused our side significant political capital. It emboldened our enemies. It damaged the confidence, and this is the worst part of it, of our fellow Americans that this administration can be trusted to make the big changes we desperately need right across the immigration refugee board. Now, Trump's message on immigration is absolutely superb. But the problem is with the messenger. He doesn't really know much policy. He really doesn't know very much history. He is addicted to twittering, which makes him look insubstantial and a little emotionally out of control. He's sloppy with details. He plays fast and loose with the truth. And he's often gruff and vulgar and lacks gravitas. What won me over to Trump was his populism. I had to look past the man. I've got to be honest with you. I would have much rather gone with the Ted Cruz as simply person to person. But I didn't think Cruz had a chance, okay? I thought Trump did. And that turned out to be the case. And he's the best ally we're going to have on immigration until one day, and from my lips to God's ears, Tom Cotton becomes president of the United States. Then we'll be in the real game. He's the guy we really need. I don't know if you watched him during the session series. He was magnificent. This is a fabulous young guy. The other problem, of course, is that this Russiagate has exposed is the fact that there are thousands upon thousands of disloyal bureaucrats in the federal system, hundreds of whom were appointed by Obama, and they are a fifth column at this point, and Trump needs to see hundreds of heads roll. They've got to get out of the system. One thing I can tell you that is happening, and I have an excellent source, my closest friend at CIS is now no longer at CIS. He is he's number 1 policymaker at the Department of Homeland Security. And if you read things like The Hill, he's described as one of the 7 people most to watch in the next on immigration. It's a guy named John Freary. DHS has dumped the day after the inauguration. They came flying into the doors at DHS and just began writing red slips. And those people are pretty much gone. Let me just add 2 points to the business about why these decisions are unconstitutional and why it's so dangerous when we see the direction we are going in. The decision of Robarts and all the other district judges are wildly off because they defy one of the least controversial aspects of our constitutional system, and that is that the president and Congress together have plenary power over immigration. That means absolute power. This is not a matter for the courts. It's not a matter for the states. The president has the power to exclude any group of people he wants, on any basis he wants, for as long as he wants. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives him and Congress the power to regulate the whole system. And in 1952, Congress added a bill to further strengthen his position in this area. And the only criterion the president has to have is his conviction, his rational conviction, that's the term, that the people who would be coming in that he seeks to block pose a threat to national security. People in Tea Parties understand the 10th Amendment. Most Americans have never heard of it. And of course, that leaves enormous power to the states to control everything not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. But there are three things expressly reserved to the executive branch in Congress. And that is plenary power over foreign commerce and interstate commerce, that's one. International affairs, as much as the state of Oregon would probably like to have a foreign relations with North Korea, they can't do it, and immigration. And when Congress and the president stand together, the president is at the apogee of his power. You wouldn't know it when all that is taken right now is a handful, 3 or 4, arch-liberal district court judges to overturn this system. There's also the issue of standing, you know? You have to have standing to bring a suit. What does standing mean? It means that you face an immediate injury. You are being injured in some way. Washington State doesn't have any standing to bring a suit on behalf of its residents because they have suffered no actual harm by immigrants who are not even here yet. Plaintiffs have to demonstrate that the alleged injury is direct and real, not hypothetical. The lawyers for Washington said, well, you know, if these people don't come in, well, that's fewer people for us to hire. Our economy might be adversely affected. Or maybe they'd come in and blow all your heads off. Another possibility. But the bottom line is the injury can't be hypothetical. Okay? There it is. Another strikingly moronic claim led by Washington State and Hawaii, this is a real beaut, is that the immigration ban violates the First Amendment, freedom of religion, or the 5th and 14th, which are equal protections before the law. Now, why is that a problem? Well, that's because the U.S. Constitution only confers rights on American citizens and foreigners who are on American soil. If you're living in Somalia and you're a Muslim and you want to come here, you can't claim religious discrimination based on anything. And by the way, look, I'll stop here. One of the most remarkable things about the position that at least 3 of these three of these district judges have made is that Trump's bans represent the establishment of religion. Think about that. What? It's an establishment of religion. Why? Well, what Trump wanted to do with recasting the immigration policies affecting, say, particularly places like Syria, is he wanted to bring in the most vulnerable and oppressed populations. And who are those, my friends? They are Christians. The most oppressed single group in the world today are Christians under Muslim rule. Syria has 10% of the population of Syria is Christian. And yet the United States has only admitted a couple of hundred of them and several tens of thousands of their Muslim oppressors. And how does bringing in a handful of Christians mean that the United States has now become de jure a Christian nation? I mean, I would have thought rather it simply says, you know, that we're a country that understands something about compassion and depression and uses it in sensible ways. But this whole business has really gone gone completely crazy. Just two, I'm sorry, just two quickies. One, where has Trump seemed to walk something very important back? And this is what it is. In his speech of August 16 in Phoenix, which, by the way, I believe to be the most thorough, thoughtful, and detailed speech on immigration ever made by any public figure in this country, in its entire history. And by the way, we have, at CIS, we have a little bit of house pride about this because the only organization's work that Trump cited in that long speech was our work. He said that there are two things that have to be changed about the system. One is we have to get rid of the outdated, totally irrational engine, which is still driving 86% of all immigration to this country, and that is extended family reunification. It's madness. So if you come from the family and you had, Uncle Jacobo came from a little town in Oaxaca, all of his relatives continue to pour into America. We have no meritocratic criteria. We don't get the best and the brightest because we don't even look for them. And Trump said it's time for us to do that. It's time for us to do what Canada does and have a point system for immigrants based on things like, first of all, character traits, no criminal background, no criminal records, but also, are these guys and gals, are they skilled machinists? Are they skilled cabinet makers? Do they have PhDs in physics? I mean, there's all kinds of ways to be valuable in an economy. It doesn't have to be that you got a doctorate. We need skilled workers, God knows, okay? So that was one of the changes that he wants to see. He's still been talking about that. But he made another pledge, and it's something that we've been pushing on him. And we said, you've got to bring the number of people we admit down. Right now, the United States accepts more immigrants every year than all the rest of the countries in the world combined. I mean, it's like, I rest my case. No one else in the world feels compelled to do this. Right now, we take in 1.2 million people annually legally, and something between 400,000 and 600,000 a year come in illegally. So we bring in the equivalent of 2 cities the size of Philadelphia every single year, and the vast majority of those folks are in grinding poverty and have bad educations and virtually no skills. Now, how are you going to function in the American economy? You're going to be at the very bottom, and you're going to make very little money, and you're either going to get earned income tax credits, or you will simply become a ward of the state. Now, we projected, and our research director, Steve Camarada, and Robert Rector at Heritage got together, and using all the algorithms we have about how you see population evolving over a period of time, and we took in all those things that are really important to know. I mean, for example, the size of immigrant families goes down. It doesn't always stay high. It goes down over time as people Americanize. So, all those factors are there. We didn't fake it. We used 2060 as the target year. If we just continue doing what we're doing, we don't do something insane like pass what the Republicans have wanted, comprehensive immigration reform, which means doubling legal immigration and amnestying the entire illegal population here. If we don't do something as wacky as that, but we just let it go along without stopping it, the projection is by 2060, we will have a 56% increase in population, bringing us up to about 500 million. Right now, we're about 330 some odd million. That's the equivalent. What does that come down in real life terms? that would be like adding the entire current populations of France, Spain, and Great Britain, and we would have 8 additional cities the size of New York. My question to you, my fellow Americans, my fellow conservatives, is do you want that? I don't think any American wants that. We've put the question out there year after year after year. You know what the average number of Americans, and this is like, these surveys are not, just handed out to Tea Parties. They go to Democrats, they go to everybody. 3% want any increase in immigration. And I'm talking about the kind of increase in immigration that would render this country completely unrecognizable. You don't even have the water out in the West, by the way, to sustain the population. We don't have the infrastructure to sustain any of this. But it's going to happen if we don't stop it. So, what I would say to you, in addition to fighting for the president's extremely intelligent immigration package, you got to remind him, by the way, don't walk back. And how do we know he walked it back? Because he had an interview with The Economist magazine. And he said, no, legal immigration is going to stay where it is. I'm going to just cut back illegal. If it's the same water, no matter what, maybe the bucket's different. It's the same water. The immigrants are the same. And this is not, I have no animus towards them. They're very, very nice people. But we're in a post-industrial, knowledge-based economy in which people with only 9th grade educations are just not going to make it. And they're not only going to suffer themselves, they're going to drag our whole system down. Anyway, you've been very patient. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We're going to have water there for you, Dr. Steinlight, so just in case you need it, there is a bottle of water there in case you need it. So in the essence of time, many of you come on your lunch hours and things. I'm going to do a couple of things. A lot of you slide in after announcements, so I'm going to just go through a couple real quick. We always want to remind you, we do have the box in the back. We do pay the church to be here. We also need to honor them by leaving by a certain time and having the tables cleaned up and chairs out. So I know our speakers are always so gracious to stay afterwards and answer questions. The other thing is just a reminder of the summit this coming weekend. If you need more information on it, take those yellow sheets with you, and then also the Republican Party fish fry tonight. I'm going to ask 2 questions, and then I know there are ones I'm not going to get to, and Dr. Steinlight will stay and answer those.
I'm not running anywhere.
He won't go anywhere. The first one is I read an email that listed Mr. Comey's in his resume and correlated it to how he had helped the Clintons further their agenda. It ascertains that he is a Clinton man. Do you think this is true? And if so, why did he bring up the reference to the Clinton emails investigation when he did?
I couldn't agree. Whoever asked that question, thank you. Mr. Comey is also a member, a chair. He is on the board of governors of the Clinton Foundation. That he should have recused himself. If you remember the role he played around the Hillary issue, was about as bizarre as it gets. I remember here's a guy who intervened twice publicly on the Hillary thing, okay? Remember? He lays out an indictment of her, which obviously was like slam dunk guilty. And then he said, there's insufficient evidence to bring a prosecution. Nonsense, okay? This, again, was politicization of law enforcement to a degree that undermines our Constitution. He should have recused himself for any role in Hillary Clinton's problems. And her problems go way beyond what we saw, and they are all self-inflicted.
If you consider yourself to be a hyphenated American, can you be truly a fully functioning citizen?
I think that's a very tough question, but I think the answer is, in the end, no. The same way I don't believe in dual citizenship. I think that's crazy. When you take a citizenship oath, you abjure and swear, you abjure all allegiance to any other country. This is it. So no, I don't think you can be, as it were, completely in America's corner. This is not to say that people can't have affection and can't have, cultural ties and associations back to the old world. I'm sure that many of you do, whether it's family tradition and all of that. I honor all of that. It's a terrific thing. And it's one of the things, by the way, that helped build up America. If you look at one of the things that we've lost are all these old world cultural associations. In fact, we've lost all kinds of associations. We're not joiners. You guys are a great exception. You join. We are living in a country where people bowl along. Fraternal organizations have gone, so many. But no, I think hyphenated Americans really have a deep issue that they need to look at. I know many of them see themselves as patriots and love the country. I don't doubt their sincerity, but I do think there are real issues, both practical and philosophical, and I think you got to go back and reconsider that judgment and perhaps stick to one.
This will be our last question, and then go ahead and storm the stage when we're done and ask them all your questions. Do you see any signs that Americans are turning against the fake media and that the media is losing its influence on elections?
Oh, certainly. Nature abhors a vacuum. People are not reading newspapers in anything like the numbers that they used to. A lot of these newspapers are, thank goodness, for those who read them, that in many cases these are family foundation sort of things and they're supported that way, but that they're not, and through their advertisers, but they don't enjoy anything like the influence that they once had, and that's their own fault. When newspapers, particularly that once had deservedly fine reputations, like the Washington Post and like the New York Times, suddenly, over a period of time, seemed to lose the ability to distinguish between an editorial and a news story, and now there's no such thing as such a distinction. People quite rightly said, I don't want to be reading a partisan rag. Now, I have to read all these partisan rags because that's my job, but you don't. There are lots of choices out there. There's a lot of good stuff, obviously, in the social media. There's a tremendous amount of good stuff online. I always recommend for people, that's my favorite site, is Real Clear Politics. Because what they do is they snatch up really smart stuff from the left, from the right, from Democrats, Republicans. You see it all, but it's very clear that it's opinion. And newspapers very much hide behind the kind of phony facade of just the facts, the Jack Webb thing. These are deeply partisan, and people don't trust them, and they don't trust them for good reason. And again, as I said, irrespective of what your politics are, if you pick up a newspaper and you cannot tell whether it's an editorial or a news story, we know that the media is in deep, deep, deep trouble.
Thank you, Dr. Steinlight, so much. Can we give Dr. Steinlight another thanks for coming and being so